Mark the Snake Sullivan and Tommy Red O'Connor were boys from Liverpool estates, but they became the most feared names in the city's criminal underworld, from smuggling heroin through quiet docks to orchestrating executions that terrorized entire neighborhoods. Their rise wasn't just about money, it was about power, fear, and survival. This is the story of how Liverpool streets were ruled by gangs and how ordinary lives were caught in a cycle of violence that no one could escape. Liverpool in the early 1980s was a city in decline, and for many of its people, life was shaped by poverty, unemployment, and frustration. The docks, once the pride of the city and a symbol of its global trade links, were shutting down one by one. Families who had relied on steady work for generations suddenly found themselves with nothing. Entire neighborhoods struggled with boarded-up houses, rising crime, and a growing sense that the system had abandoned them. For some, it was a period of despair. For others, it was the perfect opportunity. Amid the crumbling economy, petty criminals began to think bigger. The port, which had once brought wealth and prosperity, was now being used for something far darker. Shipping containers became the new gateways for heroin, arriving quietly through hidden compartments and unnoticed corners of the docks. What began with small quantities, packages slipped under the radar, soon turned into a steady stream of narcotics flooding the city. The trade was cheap, addictive, and devastatingly profitable. For men who had once hustled through car theft or petty robberies, heroin smuggling offered riches beyond their imagination. Liverpool's geography made it an ideal breeding ground for this new trade. Its access to sea routes, its long history with smuggling, and its deep connections with other port cities across Europe meant that criminal networks could expand quickly. Some of the earliest smugglers were dock workers themselves, men who knew how to move cargo without raising suspicion. Others were small-time crooks who saw a chance to turn street crime into an empire. Together, they created a shadow economy that spread through the veins of the city as quickly as the heroin spread through its users. Communities that were already broken by job losses and poverty began to crumble even further under the weight of addiction. Families watched loved ones waste away while dealers lined their pockets with cash. The police, overwhelmed and underprepared, struggled to keep up. Heroin was not just a drug, it was a weapon that tore apart entire estates, leaving behind chaos and misery. For the gangs, this chaos was power. The more desperate people became, the easier it was to recruit young men who had nothing else to lose. The first generation of heroin dealers did not see themselves as gangsters. Many were local men who thought they were just making a living. But as the money poured in, the culture of violence began to grow. Rivals clashed over turf, debts turned into beatings, and betrayals ended in bloodshed. What had begun as survival quickly transformed into something much darker. Out of the ashes of Liverpool's industrial collapse, a new underworld was being born. It was a world that would evolve from back-alley deals to international smuggling operations, and eventually to an era where guns and hitmen ruled the streets. The seeds of Liverpool's feared gangs were sown in these years of decline. Heroin was the foundation stone, the drug that gave rise to fortunes and fueled a cycle of crime that would haunt the city for decades. It was not just the story of a drug, but the story of how desperation turned into power, and how power would soon demand blood. By the early 1990s, Liverpool's underworld had begun to transform into something far more organized than the loose networks of smugglers and street dealers that had first appeared in the decade before. The heroin trade had already proven how much money could be made, and that money began to change the way crime was carried out. Instead of individuals working alone or in small, casual groups, entire neighborhoods started to fall under the influence of crews who claimed them as their own. Territory became everything, and the city gradually split into zones of power. In the North End, one group grew from the rough estates where unemployment had hit hardest. These were tight-knit men, many of whom had grown up together, sharing the same schools, football pitches, and broken futures. What bound them was more than just crime, it was loyalty forged through poverty and survival. In the South, another crew held sway near the docks, where smuggling routes gave them access to shipments before anyone else. They were less about friendship and more about ruthless ambition. Together, these rival factions marked the rise of the first true organized gangs in modern Liverpool. At first, the sense of brotherhood seemed almost unbreakable. The men at the top looked after their communities, spreading money around, buying drinks in pubs, and sometimes even covering rent for families who had fallen behind. To many locals, they were seen less as criminals and more as protectors who gave back what the state had failed to provide. But beneath this surface, a darker code was taking shape. Anyone who disobeyed orders or stepped onto the wrong territory faced violent consequences. It became clear that the gangs were not neighbors to admire but rulers to fear. The money from heroin and other drugs only deepened this culture of control. Teenagers eager for status were recruited as lookouts and messengers. They were given small tasks at first, carrying packages, watching corners, or delivering warnings. For boys who saw no future in education or work, this was an easy path to fast cash, respect, and a sense of belonging. Slowly, these young recruits hardened into soldiers, and the gangs transformed from small brotherhoods into organized hierarchies. As the profits grew, so did suspicion and rivalry. The North and South factions began to view each other not as fellow survivors, but as threats to their empires. Street corners became front lines, and deals were backed up with intimidation. Houses were raided in the middle of the night, debts were collected with brutal force, and rumors of betrayal sparked bloodshed. The idea of loyalty still mattered, but it was no longer about friendship, it was about survival. By the mid-1990s, Liverpool's gangs had established themselves as more than just local thugs. They were powerful organizations with structure, rules, and ambitions that stretched beyond their estates. What had started with smuggling through the docks had grown into a network of dealers, enforcers, and young recruits, ready to do whatever it took to climb the ladder. The brotherhoods had been born, but the seeds of violence were already planted deep within them. What began as bonds of loyalty would soon twist into rivalries that would drench the streets in blood. The 1990s in Liverpool marked the moment when the gangs fully revealed their brutality. The city was no longer just divided by invisible borders of territory. Those borders were being defended with violence that spilled into the open. It was no longer unusual to hear of a shooting on a quiet estate or to see burned-out cars left smoldering as warnings. What began as competition for control of heroin and cocaine markets turned into a war for dominance. The rules of the streets were changing, and ordinary people were caught in the crossfire. Drive-by shootings became the new weapon of choice. Cars roared through housing estates at night, windows rolled down, guns flashing in the dark. Houses linked to rival dealers were sprayed with bullets, sometimes with families still inside. The violence was designed to send messages, swift, terrifying, and impossible to ignore. At the same time, fire bombings became a common act of revenge. Homes were doused in petrol and set alight, forcing terrified families to flee into the night. Children, mothers, and the elderly often found themselves targeted simply for being connected to the wrong name. The gangs had moved beyond drug dealing. They were building reputations built on fear. Every act of violence had a purpose: to control, to silence, and to maintain power. Those who failed to pay debts on time could expect a beating so severe they would never forget. Others who refused to follow orders might disappear entirely, their bodies never found, their names spoken only in whispers. It was in this era that fear became more powerful than money. A gang leader's ability to inspire terror mattered more than his wealth. Teenagers who had once been used as lookouts now found themselves on the front lines. Boys barely 16 years old carried knives, machetes, and eventually even guns, walking the streets as soldiers for their gangs. Some were drawn in by promises of money and designer clothes, while others were simply too scared to say no. Entire generations were raised under the shadow of this violent culture, where turning your back could cost you your life. For the people living in these communities, daily life became a test of survival. Parents warned their children to avoid certain streets, shops closed early, and neighbors learned to look away rather than risk drawing attention. Even those who had nothing to do with crime found themselves trapped in a cycle of fear. A single wrong word, or even being seen with the wrong person, could make someone a target. The police struggled to contain the chaos. Raids, arrests, and patrols seemed endless, yet the violence continued. For every gang member taken off the streets, another young recruit stepped forward to take his place. The criminal networks had become too deep, too rooted in poverty and desperation, to be dismantled easily. The city's identity was changing, its reputation becoming stained by headlines of shootings and bloodshed. By the late 1990s, it was clear that Liverpool's gangs were no longer just neighborhood groups fighting for scraps. They were hardened organizations, willing to kill to protect their profits and their pride. The blood on the streets was no longer just the result of turf wars. It was a warning of what the future would hold. The gangs were evolving, and with every act of violence, they pushed the city further into a world where fear was law and survival meant obedience. By the late 1990s, Liverpool's criminal underworld was no longer confined to street corners or housing estates. The gangs that had risen from poverty and local smuggling began reaching far beyond their neighborhoods, creating international pipelines that transformed them into major players in the European drug trade. What had once been a city struggling with local heroin use now became a central hub in a network stretching from South America to mainland Europe. The scale of operations grew so large that local dealers became international traffickers, building empires that rivaled the biggest crime organizations abroad. The city's docks remained the perfect entry point. Shipping containers carried everything from fruit to furniture, and buried within these goods were hidden packages of heroin, cocaine, and cannabis. Smugglers used sophisticated techniques to disguise shipments. Drugs were pressed into fake tiles, concealed in car engines, or sealed inside crates of bananas. Customs officers faced an impossible task, checking only a fraction of the thousands of containers that passed through. For the gangs, every successful shipment meant millions in profit. Amsterdam became one of Liverpool's most important links. The Dutch capital, already notorious for its drug networks, provided both suppliers and safe passage routes into Europe. From there, contacts in Spain, Portugal, and Turkey offered access to even larger supplies of heroin and cocaine. Some Liverpool gang leaders even traveled abroad to negotiate deals directly, forging alliances with cartels and international smugglers. These relationships marked a new era. The city's criminals were no longer just small-time thugs. They were businessmen in the shadows running operations that crossed borders and oceans. Money poured in at a pace never seen before. Luxury cars lined the driveways of modest estates, and gang leaders flaunted their wealth with gold jewelry, designer clothes, and lavish parties. Behind closed doors, cash was stacked in safes, laundered through front businesses, and sent abroad to offshore accounts. With money came power, and with power came paranoia. Every deal involved risk, and every shipment carried the possibility of betrayal. Rivals watched closely, waiting for any weakness to exploit. The violence that had once been confined to local turf wars began to spread into these international dealings. Disputes over shipments sometimes ended with executions in hotel rooms in Spain or ambushes on quiet European roads. Back in Liverpool, those who failed to deliver their share of profits faced brutal punishment. The gangs had become highly organized, but they were also dangerously volatile. Trust was scarce, and loyalty was often bought with cash rather than earned through friendship. The international pipeline also intensified the devastation at home. With drugs arriving in greater quantities, addiction spread further across the city. Entire estates became flooded with cheap heroin and cocaine, and crime rates soared as addicts turned to theft to fund their habits. The very same streets that had once relied on dockwork were now dominated by dealers and users, trapped in a cycle created by the international ambitions of the gangs. By the turn of the millennium, Liverpool was firmly entrenched in the global drug economy. Its gangs had built networks that rivaled those of established cartels, and the city's name carried weight in underworld circles across Europe. The international pipeline had brought wealth and power to a select few, but it also sowed the seeds of even greater violence. With so much at stake, the next stage of the gang's evolution would demand something even darker: the rise of professional killers who would enforce order with bullets instead of words. As the new millennium approached, the violence in Liverpool escalated to a level the city had never seen before. The heroin and cocaine trade had made some gang leaders wealthy beyond imagination, but wealth alone could not guarantee survival. With so much money at stake, betrayal became inevitable, and fear became the currency of power. It was no longer enough to intimidate rivals with threats or beatings. To protect their empires, the gangs began hiring professional hitmen, silent, precise and lethal killers whose only job was to eliminate anyone who stood in the way. These hitmen were often strangers to the city, brought in for their skill and their detachment. They operated with efficiency, striking without warning and disappearing before anyone could react. Cars were shot up on quiet streets, homes were raided and burned, and rival leaders were gunned down at traffic lights or in back alleys. Even the most cautious criminals knew that a single misstep could bring them face to face with a professional killer. The city's underworld had entered a new era where bullets, not words, decided disputes. For the gangs, hiring hitmen was both a tactical and psychological strategy. The mere presence of an assassin created fear that extended beyond immediate victims. Rival crews hesitated before making moves. Street dealers double-checked every delivery, and informers thought twice before betraying anyone. The hitmen became symbols of power, invisible forces that reminded everyone that the gangs were untouchable, until the moment they were not. The escalation of violence also changed the internal structure of the gangs. Loyalty was no longer measured only by friendship or family ties. It was now measured by fear and obedience. Trusted members could no longer assume safety simply because they had long-standing connections. Any hint of betrayal, laziness, or hesitation could result in sudden, fatal consequences. Even those high in the hierarchy were not immune. Leaders had to constantly watch their backs, aware that the very people they trusted to run operations might turn against them if it suited their interests. Street-level enforcement became more coordinated and ruthless. Younger gang members were trained to carry out attacks or provide backup, while the hitmen handled the most dangerous assignments. Assassinations became choreographed operations, designed to send a message to everyone involved. A single execution could alter the balance of power across multiple gangs, demonstrating that no one was safe and that loyalty was secondary to survival. The presence of hitmen also intensified the terror in local communities. Residents who had once tolerated low-level violence were now living in constant fear. Children were warned to stay inside, families avoided certain streets, and neighborhoods became ghost towns at night. Innocent people were sometimes caught in the crossfire, and stories of brutal killings spread quickly, reinforcing the gang's reputation as untouchable and unstoppable. By the mid-2000s, Liverpool's criminal scene had fully transformed. The gangs had evolved from heroin smugglers to highly organized, fear-driven organizations that ruled through a combination of money, intimidation, and lethal enforcement. The hitmen were a chilling reminder that power in this underworld was maintained by violence, and that betrayal or weakness could no longer be forgiven. The city had become a theater of death, where survival depended on constant vigilance, and where every shadow could conceal a killer. The age of casual crime had ended, the age of professional murder had arrived, and Liverpool would never be the same. By the mid-2000s, the chaos and bloodshed in Liverpool had reached a level that could no longer be ignored. The city's gangs, now armed with international contacts, wealth, and professional hitmen, had created an underworld that seemed untouchable. But while the criminals expanded their empires, the authorities were beginning to adapt. Task forces were formed specifically to tackle organized crime, combining intelligence, surveillance, and coordination with regional and national police forces. Wiretaps, hidden cameras, and undercover officers became critical tools in a battle that had long been fought in the shadows. The gangs, once confident in their ability to operate freely, found themselves facing an enemy that could infiltrate even in most secure operations. Meetings that had previously been held in warehouses or secluded estates were now approached with caution. Every phone call, every transaction, every delivery was scrutinized. Yet even the most paranoid criminals could not prevent the rise of another threat: the informer. Trusted members of the gangs began to turn on their own leaders, driven by fear, money, or the promise of reduced sentences. Friends, family, and longtime associates could no longer be assumed loyal. Informers became the ultimate weapon in the fight against Liverpool's gangs. Some were low-level members who had been caught and offered deals, while others were insiders disillusioned by the brutality surrounding them. Their testimonies provided police with invaluable information: shipment routes, safe houses, hidden stashes of money, and even the identities of professional hitmen. Each piece of intelligence was a key to dismantling the networks that had terrorized the city for decades. But using informers was a dangerous game. If their cover was blown, the consequences were fatal. Many were killed or disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and some were forced into secret relocation programs to protect their lives. The courtrooms became arenas where the secrets of the gangs were revealed. Wiretap recordings, surveillance footage, and insider testimony exposed the inner workings of the underworld. Leaders who had once seemed untouchable found themselves facing life sentences, with years of meticulous planning unraveling in front of judges and juries. Yet even behind bars, some tried to maintain control over their empires, relying on loyal soldiers outside to carry out orders and intimidate witnesses. The battle between law enforcement and the gangs was never absolute. It was a constant struggle, where victories were measured in arrests and convictions, but fear and violence persisted on the streets. The police crackdowns also had a ripple effect within the gangs themselves. Paranoia intensified as trust eroded completely. Suspected informers were eliminated, often brutally, and entire crews sometimes disbanded to avoid attention. Rivalries already fierce grew even more unpredictable as leaders feared betrayal from within as much as attacks from outside. The cycle of violence continued, but now it was coupled with the threat of legal consequences, forcing gang members to operate with even greater secrecy and sophistication. Liverpool's residents, meanwhile, began to see glimpses of hope. Police raids and arrests brought a sense that justice was possible, even in the heart of such entrenched crime. Yet the story of the gangs also served as a reminder that fear could not be completely eradicated. The combination of informers and law enforcement had begun to dismantle the underworld, but the legacy of violence, control, and corruption had left permanent scars on the city. The balance of power was shifting, but the cost of survival in Liverpool's criminal underworld remained higher than ever. By the late 2000s, the gangs that had once seemed untouchable in Liverpool were finally facing the consequences of decades of violence, greed, and ambition. Years of ruthless expansion, international trafficking, and professional hitmen had built empires of wealth and fear. But no empire is invincible. Massive police operations, combined with the testimonies of informers, began to systematically dismantle these organizations. Raids swept through estates and warehouses, seizing weapons, drugs, and cash, while courtrooms became the battlegrounds where former allies turned on each other. The untouchables were no longer untouchable. The arrests were shocking in their scale. Mansions once filled with luxury cars and stacks of cash were emptied, stripped of their symbols of power. Properties that had served as safe houses were raided, revealing hidden compartments filled with drugs, documents, and ledgers detailing the inner workings of the criminal networks. For law enforcement, these seizures were not just victories. They were the first real glimpse into the sophisticated organized structures that had enabled Liverpool's gangs to operate with such impunity. The sheer volume of evidence painted a clear picture. The gangs were no longer street-level operations. They were powerful, well-connected syndicates with influence that reached far beyond the city. Inside the courtrooms, the drama unfolded like a story of betrayal and greed. Long-standing alliances fractured under pressure, Members who had once relied on each other for survival testified against one another in exchange for reduced sentences or immunity. Leaders who had ruled with fear for years were forced to confront the testimonies of their own soldiers, detailing murders, robberies, and drug trafficking operations. The trials revealed a world of calculated violence, manipulation, and ambition that had remained hidden from the public for years. Even after imprisonment, some former leaders tried to maintain control over their empires. Smuggled mobile phones, coded messages, and loyal associates outside allowed them to continue directing operations from behind bars. The law had disrupted their freedom, but the influence of their networks persisted. However, the arrests and convictions sent a clear message to the rest of the criminal world: no one was beyond reach. Those who had once believed in the untouchability of their power were forced to confront a new reality where prison cells replaced mansions and fear of law enforcement outweighed the fear of rivals. The ripple effects of the crackdowns reshaped Liverpool's criminal landscape. Younger gang members either fled, went underground, or sought to align themselves with new emerging factions. Trust became even more fragile, and the once solid networks fractured under pressure. While some gangs attempted to rebuild, the power vacuum created opportunities for law enforcement to tighten control and for rival factions to compete violently over remaining territory. The city that had once been dominated by a few feared empires now became a battlefield of uncertainty, where alliances were temporary and survival required constant vigilance. For the citizens of Liverpool, the fall of the untouchables offered a mix of relief and caution. Streets that had been plagued by shootings and intimidation slowly began to show signs of normal life. But the memory of decades of violence lingered. Families and communities had endured fear and loss, and the scars of those years could not be erased by arrests alone. The era of the untouchables had ended, but the legacy of their reign, the fear, the corruption, and the cycles of crime remained embedded in the city's identity. Liverpool had survived, but it had been forever changed by the men who once ruled it through power and blood. Today, Liverpool's gangs are fractured, but the shadow of their past still looms over the city. The heroin trade that gave rise to the first organized crews has been joined by cocaine, firearms, and new forms of crime. The streets remain a dangerous place, especially for young people who are drawn into the allure of fast money, status, and respect. For them, the promise of power is often far greater than the risk. Even though the lessons of the past are written in blood and prison records, the city carries the scars of decades of violence, and the stories of the old gangs serve as warnings of what happens when desperation meets ambition. The evolution of Liverpool's criminal underworld shows a terrifying pattern. Poverty and lack of opportunity breed crime, which attracts money, and money brings more violence. Each generation of gang members has learned from the last, becoming more organized, more ruthless, and better equipped to evade law enforcement. Although police crackdowns have dismantled major operations, smaller factions continue to operate under the radar, maintaining the same patterns of fear, loyalty, and betrayal that have defined the city for decades. The cycle of crime is far from broken. It has only shifted into new forms and new players. Even as the most infamous leaders were imprisoned or killed, their reputations lingered. Young gang members idolized them, studying their rise and imagining themselves in their place. The lessons of violence, intimidation, and strategy became a part of the city's culture, passed down quietly from one generation to the next. Some sought legitimate work as a way to escape the streets, but the pull of easy money and instant respect proved too strong for many. The underworld continued to thrive in pockets, its influence embedded in certain estates, clubs, and social circles. Liverpool itself has changed, but the legacy of the gangs is visible everywhere. Luxury cars parked in modest estates, young men walking in groups, and whispered stories of old rivalries serve as reminders of a time when fear ruled the streets. Communities that survived years of terror have adapted, yet the sense of vulnerability remains. Residents remember the chaos of drive-by shootings, the terror of firebombed houses, and the silent dread of knowing that someone in the shadows could end their life without warning. For them, the gang's history is not just a story, it is a lived experience, a memory that shapes daily life even today. The evolution from heroin smugglers to international hitmen illustrates how criminal enterprise can adapt, grow, and survive despite intense pressure. It is a story of ambition, greed, and violence, but also of fear and survival. The gangs of Liverpool may no longer hold the same power they once did, but their legacy continues to shape the city, influencing both the criminal world and the communities caught in its wake. The lesson is stark. When crime becomes entwined with opportunity and desperation, the results are long-lasting, leaving a city forever changed. Liverpool's underworld is no longer dominated by a few untouchable empires, but the echoes of their reign remain. The history of these gangs serves as both a cautionary tale and a grim record of what happens when lawlessness, money, and ambition collide. The streets that once saw the rise of heroin empires, violent turf wars, and professional hitmen now live with the memory of fear. The city has survived, but the shadow of the gangs persists. A reminder that the cycle of crime, violence, and ambition never truly ends. It only evolves.